The night didn't end so much as it thinned. A pale gray seeped into the gullies beyond the wire, turning the jagged hills into layered shadows. At Outpost Sable, the last watch of the night shift moved the way tired people move, quietly, carefully, try not to wake the part of themselves that had to function again in a few hours. Then a dull flash bloomed on the far slope. The sensor pole, one of the skinny, lonely sentinels the outpost relied on, shuddered and snapped like a matchstick. A fraction of a second later, the sound arrived, a hard, hollow thump that rolled through the rocks and into the compound. Before anyone could speak, the perimeter lights went out. Not a gentle fade, a sudden, surgical darkness, like a hand had reached down and pinched the base between two fingers. "Contact! Contact!" someone shouted from the nearest tower. Boots pounded. Doors banged. A quick reaction team spilled out of the barracks and sprinted toward the wall, helmets half fastened, rifles coming up as they ran. They made it 10 steps into the open, and the world turned into intersecting lines of fire. Rounds cracked from the ridgeline. Not random. Not panicked. Controlled bursts that stitched the yard and forced bodies down behind Hesco in concrete. The geometry was cruel and clean. High ground on the angles, and every route to the wall was a funnel. A machine gun on the north side tried to answer. The gunner got a burst off, 2 seconds of defiance, before the enemy's mortars found him. The first round landed short. The second landed long. The third landed exactly where the crew had scrambled for cover, as if someone had been watching them do it. Pre-range points, Mara thought through the noise, through the rising shout and the grit that shook from the ceiling in her small visitor room. That's not luck. That's rehearsal. The radio on the table beside her son's cot spat static. A voice fought through the hiss. "Sable, this is," and then vanished, swallowed like a candle in a wind tunnel. The satellite link indicator on the little comms panel flickered green, then dead, then green again. False hope. Worse than nothing because it baited you into moving, into exposing yourself for a message that wouldn't arrive. Jamming, Mara realized. Not constant, pulsing. Someone was turning it on and off, listening between pulses. In the courtyard outside, a young lieutenant, fresh face smeared with dust, tried to pull sectors together with his arms because the radios weren't doing their job. He pointed toward the western berm, then the north wall, then the ops room side. His mouth was open, yelling something she couldn't hear over the crack of rifles and the low, wet concussion of mortars. Casualty screams did what comms couldn't. They carried. A medic dragged a wounded soldier behind a Hesco barrier, leaving a dark smear in the dust. The medic's hands moved fast, not graceful. Pressure, bandage, a quick glance up that asked the hills, why now? Mara stayed where she'd been told to stay down. Away from windows. A visitor. A liability. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply moved the way she always did when things got bad, into the smallest, safest line of sight and the quietest possible place her mind could work. There was a narrow window slit in the visitor room, intended more for air than observation. Mara leaned toward it until one eye could see the compound and a slice of ridgeline beyond. She didn't look for people. People moved too much. She watched patterns. Muzzle flashes punctured the gloom, tiny blooms that appeared, disappeared, and reappeared from different rocks like a code. Bursts came in controlled waves, 2 or 3 short strings, then a pause. During the pause, the base would try to respond, shouts, movement, a gunner lifting up to fire. Then the burst returned precisely when someone dared to lift a head. And there was something else, an odd, quiet gap, not just a lull in firing, but a listening pause, like the enemy was checking for something in the air. Another explosion hit the generator shack. The world filled with smoke that crawled low through the compound, wrapping Hesco walls and turning the yard into a gray blur. Visibility collapsed. In that smoke, the defenders were silhouettes to the ridge, dark shapes moving against lighter haze. Ammo was burning fast. Mara could see it in the frantic rhythm of return fire. Too many shots at flashes, too many magazines emptied into guesses. The attackers took advantage, pushing closer now. RPG teams, 2 figures, one carrying the tube, one the rounds, moved in short sprints between rocks, probing for an angle on the wall. A rocket whooshed and detonated against a corner of Hesco, showering the yard with dirt and fragments. The breach attempt wasn't fully formed yet, but it was coming. Mara's mind narrowed. Where's the brain? It wasn't the riflemen firing into the yard. They were the teeth. The brain was the one controlling the pulses, the one correcting mortar rounds, the one deciding when to pause and listen. On the ridge, she caught a flash that wasn't muzzle fire. A brief, rhythmic glimmer, like a small screen being covered and uncovered. A radio? A device? The jamming had a heartbeat. Someone was keying it. Below, a soldier shouted for the lieutenant, and the lieutenant turned, exposing his side. The ridge answered with a burst that forced him down, hard. Protocol was gone. The outpost was a scattered collection of people trying not to be killed. Then silence. Not full silence. The fight still raged. But in the middle of it, a single sound cut through. A clean crack that didn't belong to the chaotic pops and rattles of the defenders' rifles. A precision shot. Inside the wire. Mara didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She watched. On the ridge, a figure with something to his face, radio handset, maybe jerked and folded. He didn't fall dramatically. He simply ceased being upright. The device in his hand slipped, caught the first light of morning, and vanished into the rocks. The jamming flickered. For half a second, the comms panel beside Mara's bed went steady, green, then back to chaos, as if the enemy had realized the mistake and slammed the jammer on again. Proof, Mara thought. Someone is taking out the brains. Another crack. An RPG gun arose from behind a rock, tube angling toward the wall, and then he dropped like the string had been cut. The assistant beside him froze, half standing, unsure whether to grab the tube or crawl away. The breach attempt stalled, just long enough for defenders to breathe. In the yard, the young lieutenant lifted his head again, eyes wide, scanning the towers as if expecting a friendly sniper above. But the towers were blind in the smoke. And those shots, they weren't coming from up there. They were coming from somewhere the enemy didn't expect. Mara leaned back from the slit and listened to the chaos outside, the panicked voices, the crunch of boots. Somewhere inside Outpost Sable, a shooter was working with calm purpose. And in the sudden, strange space created by those two shots, one thought rose in the minds of everyone still breathing. Who is saving us? 24 hours earlier, Outpost Sable had felt like every other remote place built out of necessity and stubbornness. It sat in a shallow bowl of rock and scrub, its Hesco walls stacked like tired shoulders. Two watchtowers watched the main approach routes. A small ops room, more cramped than impressive, held the communications rack, the sensor log drives, and the maps that mattered. A generator shack coughed diesel fumes all day, keeping lights and equipment alive. Beyond the wire, one Overwatch hill rose just high enough to be a problem. A piece of terrain the outpost couldn't truly own without spreading itself thin. The supply convoy was late. Again, that was how it started. Routine inconvenience with teeth. Roads slow, the captain said, as if roads here could ever be fast. Captain Harlow had the steady, weathered look of someone who'd learned not to waste emotion on predictable disappointments. He stood in the yard with his hands on his hips while a few soldiers unloaded what little had arrived by airdrop. Inside the ops room, Corporal Daniel Reyes leaned over the comms rack, brow furrowed. He was young enough to still be surprised by problems, old enough to know surprise didn't fix them. "You seeing it too?" the lieutenant asked from behind him. Daniel didn't look up. Satellite links doing that thing again. What thing? It's there, then it's not. Same time every night. Like someone's testing the edge of it. The lieutenant shrugged. Weather. Daniel shook his head. Weather doesn't have a schedule. He said it quietly, like he didn't want the sentence to become true by being spoken too loudly. When Mara arrived, she looked like she'd stepped out of a different world. She wore plain clothes and carried only a small bag and a compact, locked hard case that the escort had inspected twice. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot. Her face held the kind of calm that wasn't fragile. It wasn't the calm of someone who didn't understand danger. It was the calm of someone who had already met danger and refused to let it choose her expression. Daniel's smile when he saw her was immediate and unguarded. "Mom," he said, voice cracking slightly, and then he hugged her hard enough that the hard case bumped his leg. Mara hugged him back, one hand on the back of his head for just a moment, the way she'd done when he was small and nightmares were easy to identify. "You've gotten thinner," she murmured. "You've gotten Bozier," he whispered back, and it was the closest thing to normal they'd had in months. Most of the unit was polite. Some were curious. A few were irritated. A senior specialist named Kravitz, loud, confident, always performing for the room, made a show of looking at the hard case. "What's that?" he asked, grin crooked. "Souvenirs? Snacks? A bake sale for the boys." Mara didn't answer immediately. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that didn't invite more conversation. Daniel bristled. "It's personal." Captain Harlow stepped in. "She's here under the morale program. Treat her like a guest." Kravitz threw up his hands. "Yes, sir. No tourists in the line of fire." "Got it. Tourist," Mara thought later, sitting on the edge of Daniel's cot in the small visitor room. She didn't resent it. People reached for labels when they didn't know where to place someone. Captain Harlow gave her an orientation the way he'd give it to anyone who didn't live by the base's rhythms. "If anything happens, you stay in here," he said. "You don't wander. You don't go looking. You don't try to help. The safest thing you can do is stay out of the way." Protocol, spoken like a prayer. Mara nodded. Understood. But understanding rules and believing they would hold were different things. When Daniel showed her around, he did it with pride. Watchtowers, the small mess area, the generator shack humming like a tired animal. He pointed out the ops room. "That's my kingdom," he joked. Inside, the comms rack was a wall of wires and labeled switches. Tape tags marked repairs, workarounds, and the little compromises remote outposts always made with reality. Mara stood in the doorway longer than Daniel expected. On the wall, a terrain map was pinned beneath clear plastic. Colored lines traced patrol routes, observation points, sensor placements. Mara leaned in, her eyes moving across ridge lines and dry cuts in the earth. Her finger rose and traced a ridge that curved like a spine above the base. "That hill," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "We don't own it. Not all the way. Too exposed. We watch it." Mara's finger moved down the map, following a dry creek bed that twisted behind that hill and disappeared into scrub. "And this," she said. Daniel blinked. "That's nothing. It's dry." "Dry doesn't mean unused," Mara replied. Daniel laughed lightly, but there was a small unease behind it, as if her words had touched something he'd felt but refused to name. As they walked the perimeter, Mara's eyes tracked angles the way other people track scenery. There were dead spaces, places the towers couldn't see because of the berm, the way the HESCO walls turned, the way rock outcrops created blind pockets right up against the compound. Small flaws in a defensive picture that would look complete to someone who didn't know how quickly a flaw could become a door. That night, over bland food in the mess, Daniel told her about the interference. "Same time," he said. "Like clockwork. The link gets jumpy." "You told the captain?" Mara asked. "Yeah, he's aware." "And what does he think?" Daniel shrugged. "Could be a lot of things." Mara's gaze drifted to the ops room door. "What's the one thing you can't afford to lose in that room?" she asked. Daniel frowned. "The radios?" Mara didn't answer. She just looked at him a moment longer than was comfortable. When he took her back to the visitor room, Mara set the locked hard case under the cot, out of sight. Daniel noticed, of course. "You really bring that all this way?" he asked. Mara's smile returned, softer now. "It's something I promised myself I'd do with you when you were older." Daniel grinned. "A surprise?" "A memory," she corrected. "If we get the chance." He didn't press. He knew her well enough to understand when questions would make her retreat. Later, Captain Harlow called a quick briefing. The intel update was short and unpleasant. "Hostile group in the area has been organized," Harlow said. "Testing response times. Filming attacks. They want a show. They want us reacting." "Propaganda," Kravitz muttered, rolling his shoulders like he wanted the fight. "Or something else," Harlow replied. "Either way, they're not amateurs." Night fell. The outpost settled into its uneasy sleep. Mara lay awake. Outside, The generator hum rose and fell in a pattern that didn't feel like mechanical randomness. Somewhere in the distance, she heard engines, brief, careful, then silent, like someone moving into place, then pausing. Measured, Mara thought. Not random. In the dark, Daniel's voice came quiet from the cot. "You okay?" Mara kept her tone gentle. "Just listening. It'll be fine," Daniel said, like he needed to believe it. Mara didn't contradict him. She reached over and touched his hand once, briefly. When Daniel left to double-check the comms rack before his shift, because he trusted her instincts more than he admitted, Mara sat alone and stared at the locked hard case. She hadn't come to Outpost Sable to be a hero. She had come to see her son. But the world didn't always respect intentions. Now, in the present, Outpost Sable was paying for every small compromise it had ever made. The opening barrage hadn't targeted bodies. It had targeted function. Sensors first, power second, then the lanes that forced defenders into predictable cover. Mortars didn't chase people, they punished patterns. The jamming didn't blanket the air, it pulsed. On, off, on, off. Each gap felt like a trapdoor, tempting someone to transmit, to call for help, to reveal their location. Then the jammer would slam down again, swallowing the call and leaving only the shape of desperation behind. In the courtyard, the defenders had become islands. Handheld radios worked only if you were close enough to smell the other person's sweat. Anything beyond a few meters dissolved into static. Lieutenant Parker, young, stubborn, and suddenly older, crawled behind a low wall, trying to count heads, trying to make a plan with pieces he couldn't see. "North side, respond," he shouted. "North, talk to me." Static answered him from his handset. Smoke from the generator shack drifted low, mixing with dust kicked up by impacts. It turned the air into a thick, grainy soup that stung eyes and erased distances. Tower spotters leaned out, squinting, but their sight lines were gone. High ground owned the morning, and the base was blind. The machine gun on the north had overheated. The crew swapped barrels with shaking hands, but every moment spent fixing was a moment not firing. Rifle mags disappeared fast, because shooting at flashes was like trying to punch a shadow. Then Daniel got hit. He'd been in the ops room corridor when the comms panel flickered steady green for a heartbeat. He'd seen it and moved instinctively toward the rack, toward the satellite unit, toward the thing he could fix. He never made it. A sharp impact, a grunt, and he dropped behind a wall with his hand pressed tight against his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against dust. Mara saw him through the slit. The world narrowed. Captain Harlow shouted for the medic, but the medic was already knee-deep in triage, already moving between bodies like a man trying to hold back an ocean with his hands. Time pressure tightened. There had been a scheduled helicopter run near sunrise. Resupply, a brief swap, maybe a chance to send wounded out. But with comms dead, the base couldn't confirm, couldn't divert, couldn't warn. The bird would come if it came, and if it didn't, Outpost Sable would be alone. The enemy wasn't rushing. That was the worst part. A small assault element probed the wire like fingers testing a wound. Another element stayed high, feeding the fight with overwatch and mortar correction. Their rhythm wasn't frantic, it was patient. They were shaping the base, turning it into something they could control. Then Mara noticed what the defenders hadn't yet had time to see. On the far side of the compound, movement wasn't aimed at the barracks or the mess area. It was angled toward the ops room side, toward the corridor that held the sensor logs and the hardened data module that Daniel had mentioned in passing, the thing that recorded interdiction routes and timings. They want something, Mara realized. This isn't just a raid. This is a theft. She watched the ridge again. The pulsing dead air synced with a small figure's rhythm. Someone keying a device, pausing, keying again, listening between pulses, trying to catch a transmission, to triangulate a radio, to locate leadership. Mara's heartbeat slowed. She wasn't calm because she wasn't afraid. She was calm because fear didn't help with math. Captain Harlow's voice cut through the chaos as he pushed into the visitor room, ducking low. "Mara," he shouted. "Stay down. Don't." He stopped when he saw her posture. Not cowering, not frozen. Watching. Mara pointed, 2 fingers precise toward the ridge. "Radio operator," she said. "And a spotter." They're the engines. Harlow stared at her, confusion flickering across his face. How do you? A crack answered for her. Somewhere inside the compound, another precise shot rang out. On the ridge, a figure leaned forward as if to speak into a handset and then collapsed. Mortar rounds that followed landed wide. One thumped harmlessly outside the wire. Another kicked dirt in an empty yard. The correction was gone, at least for a moment. A sliver of relief moved through the defenders, like air returning to lungs. Then the enemy shifted. Not panicked, not retreating, adapting. Muzzle flashes appeared from a different cluster of rocks. Fire shifted, trying to triangulate the shooter's angle. The careful pause. Listen. Fire rhythm changed too, as if the enemy was now listening for the crack of a rifle rather than a radio call. And over it all, rising like an insect in the morning haze, came a new sound. A drone. Not loud, but persistent, its buzz threading through the smoke like a needle. Mara's gaze moved to the ops room corridor. The door shook under a blast. Hinges screamed. Dust fell. Inside, someone shouted for reinforcements, but the shout vanished in a gunfire. The attackers were seconds from breaching the place that held the thing they came for. And Daniel, her son, was bleeding within sight of it. Captain Harlow grabbed Mara's arm. Stay. Mara's voice cut through him, steady as a blade. They're going to take it, and then they'll kill everyone who saw. Harlow's grip tightened, then loosened, as if his mind was trying to choose between rules and reality. Outside, another mortar round landed, closer this time. The enemy had a new spotter or enough experience to walk rounds him by feel. The trap was closing. Mara had spent years telling herself she was done. Done with the smell of burnt fuel in the back of her throat. Done with the way silence could be louder than gunfire. Done with the feeling of being reduced to function while the rest of the world lived in softness. She had built a different life on purpose. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. She had not come to Outpost Sable to return to any of it. But then she saw Daniel's hand pressed to his side, his jaw clenched against pain, his eyes searching for reassurance he didn't have time to ask for. Waiting, Mara realized, wasn't patience. Waiting was surrender. She slid the locked hard case out from under the cot. Captain Harlow watched her, and for a moment his face tightened as if he was about to bark an order that would restore the world to neat lines. Mara. She flipped the latches with practiced fingers. Inside wasn't sentiment. Inside was purpose. A carefully maintained precision rifle, clean, protected, configured with the kind of care that came from habit. Not a toy, not a trophy. The kind of tool you carried when you expected to rely on it. Harlow's eyes widened. What the? Authorized, Mara said, because she knew what his mind would jump to. Paperwork went through. I was supposed to use it at the range with him. A day. A memory. A visitor doesn't bring. A visitor, Mara said, doesn't get mortared. Harlow stared at her, then past her toward the corridor where his people were losing ground. Protocol said no. Reality said they were out of options. For a long beat, the captain didn't move. He simply breathed, weighing his career against the bodies outside, weighing rules against the faces he'd promised to bring home. Then he gave a single, almost invisible nod. Not permission written on paper. Permission written in necessity. Mara lifted the rifle and felt the old familiarity settle into her shoulders, like a language she hadn't spoken in years returning with one cruel syllable at a time. She checked the optic. The illumination flickered. The battery was weak, maybe cold, maybe age. The little red glow died. No help there. Fine, she thought. Old ways. She slung the rifle and moved to the door. Outside, chaos ruled. But chaos had rhythm, and Mara had always been good at hearing it. She didn't sprint. Sprinting drew eyes. Sprinting was loud. She used a dead space. A maintenance ladder behind the visitor building, half hidden by Hesco. A narrow roofline that ran along the back of the ops room. A half-collapsed storage lean-to that leaned against the comms mast like a tired shoulder. Places the towers couldn't see. Places the enemy couldn't imagine a visitor using. She timed her movement to impacts. When mortars hit, everything else was briefly deaf. When the enemy fired in bursts, the defenders answered, and the world filled with noise. Mara moved during the noise. Silence inside violence. Halfway across the roofline, the drone's buzz grew louder. It drifted overhead, searching, hunting for movement, for muzzle flash, for anything that didn't belong. Mara flattened under a corrugated overhang, pressing herself into shadow. Dust and smoke swirled, blurring outlines. The drone hovered, patient. She didn't curse it. She didn't panic. She waited until a mortar round hit near the wire, and the air shuddered. The drone wobbled slightly in the turbulence. Then Mara moved again, 3 steps, controlled, and into the blind angle behind the comms mast. The perch wasn't heroic. It wasn't a tower with a flag. It was a maintenance platform behind the mast, a place meant for technicians, not fighters. From there, the ridge line was visible in an oblique slice, a strange angle that cut beneath the enemy's expected lines of observation. The wind off the ridge brought the smell of burnt diesel and dust. Grit pressed into Mara's teeth. Her hands were steady anyway. Below, Outpost Sable was still pinned. Mara raised the rifle and used the reticle the way she'd been taught before optics did the thinking for people. She tracked the ridge, searching for the brain again. There, movement that synced with the pulsing dead air. A figure hunched over something, device, handset, antenna, keying, pausing, keying again. And she could feel it, even without hearing it clearly. Enemy fire waiting for those pauses. Listening between pulses. Ammo was limited. Match rounds. Not many. Every shot had to matter. Mara built a ladder in her mind. First, the jammer. Restore breath to the air. Second, the spotter. Stop the mortars from landing like judgment. Third, the breach teams, especially RPGs. Fourth, the leader. Cut the hands that synchronized the push. She exhaled, slow, and let the world shrink to a single point. The rifle cracked. On the ridge, the figure at the device jolted and dropped. The jammer's rhythm stuttered like a heart skipping. For the first time since the attack began, the comms inside the base found a brief thread of clarity. A short call punched through, broken, breathless, but real. Harlow copy. Mara didn't smile. She simply chambered the next round, eyes already moving down the ladder. Because the enemy would understand now. And once they understood, they would come for her. The moment the jammer stuttered, the fight changed. Not because the enemy stopped shooting, he didn't, but because for a heartbeat, Outpost Sable remembered how to think. Captain Harlow's voice snapped through a handheld radio at close range. Not pretty, not clean, but enough. Inner perimeter. Reinforce ops room side. Move wounded now. A fire team dragged the injured into deeper cover, while another pushed toward the ops corridor. Rifles up, moving with purpose instead of desperation. Lieutenant Parker, face streaked with dust, grabbed the nearest soldier by the vest and pointed him toward a sector with a clarity that hadn't been possible a minute ago. Order seat back in, bought by a single shot. Mara stayed on the perch, alone behind the comms mast, with smoke sliding past her like water. Target ladder, she reminded herself. Force multipliers first. She found the jammer operator's assistant. Another figure scrambling to pull the device back into position, trying to bring the pulse back. Mara waited until the figure lifted the antenna, exposing himself for a fraction of a second in the pale dawn. Crack! He dropped. The antenna fell sideways, catching on rock. Jamming collapsed again, longer this time. On the ridge, confusion rippled. The enemy's fire hesitated, not stopping, but losing its timing, like a drummer missing a beat. That was the opening. Mara shifted her aim slightly and found the one she'd been looking for, the assault leader. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most armored. He was the one whose body language made others move. Hand signals, head turns, the subtle confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He stood half-covered behind a boulder, watching the base through binoculars, gesturing in short, sharp motions. Mara felt the weight of the shot, not because it was difficult, because she knew what it would do. She exhaled. The rifle cracked. The leader's arm froze mid-gesture. He slumped sideways, binoculars tumbling from his hands and catching light as they fell. The ridgeline shooters faltered. The assault element below hesitated, suddenly unsensed, teeth without a brain. It was the turning point. Captain Harlow seized it like a man grabbing a rope in a flood. "Push the corridor," he shouted, voice raw. "Lock it down." The defenders moved, not heroically, but efficiently. A pair reinforced the ops room door with whatever they could, creating an ugly, stubborn barrier. Another pair shifted to cover the LZ side, anticipating the next phase, survival until extraction. Mara's eyes moved down the ladder again. Mortar spotter. She found him by behavior. The one peeking, adjusting, peeking again, communicating with someone out of sight. He wasn't firing. He was measuring. Mara waited for the moment. He leaned out, and then, crack. He dropped. Mortar rounds that followed landed wrong. One too far, one too short, bracketing nothing but dirt. The pressure on the courtyard eased like a fist unclenching. Next, RPG teams. Mara tracked the rocks closer to the wire, where two figures were trying to regain momentum. One lifted a tube. Another reached for a round. Crack. The assistant fell back into shadow. The gunner froze, suddenly alone, and the tube dipped, useless without the teamwork that made it quick. Crack. The gunner dropped. Below, a cheer tried to rise from someone's throat and died, because cheering was a luxury. They weren't winning. They were surviving, and the enemy wasn't done. They adapted mid-fight the way competent predators always did. The drone's buzz changed pitch as it shifted purpose. It wasn't just looking at the base now. It was hunting the angle, hovering, drifting, trying to catch the faint signature of muzzle flash from somewhere inside the wire. On the ridge, a heavier weapon appeared, set up fast, aimed not at the courtyard but at the comms mast area, as if the enemy had guessed the general region of Mara's perch. Then worse, movement in the dry creek bed behind the Overwatch hill. A small flanker team. Climbers. Quiet. They were using the terrain Mara had traced on the map. They were coming through the dead space. Mara felt it before she heard it. The shift in the base's defensive rhythm. The subtle tightening of danger. A burst hit the comms mast. Metal sparked. Her perch shuddered. Dust fell into her optic and smeared the lens. The world through the glass went hazy. Equipment failing. Constraints stacking. Mara wiped the lens with her sleeve, but it only spread the grime. She adjusted, fired less, moved inches between shots, changing position by small amounts so the drone couldn't lock her down. Below, Captain Harlow's people were moving wounded toward the LZ side in short, disciplined bursts, using smoke intentionally now, throwing it where it blinded the ridge, not where it blinded themselves. Then Mara heard it. Boots on metal, faint but unmistakable, coming from below her platform. The flanker team had breached the outer dead space. Now she was being hunted from inside the perimeter too. For a single, sharp moment, Mara's mind split into two urgent needs. A ridge shooter had just exposed himself. High value, clear line. But the boots below meant she might lose the perch. And if she lost the perch, the base lost its lifeline. Fear tried to rise. Mara pushed it down into function. She swung the rifle downward, peering through haze and smoke. A shadow moved, climbing, hands gripping the ladder rungs. Lead climber. Mara didn't hesitate. Two rapid, controlled shots, closer than any she'd taken so far. The lead climber jerked and fell backward, landing hard in the dirt below. The second climber froze, half up, half down, caught in the terrible decision of whether to continue or flee. Crack! The second climber dropped, collapsing into the shadow. Mara stayed still, listening, waiting for more. None came. On the ridge, the heavier weapon fired again, chewing in her cover, chipping metal, sending a ricochet that snapped past her ear close enough to feel like a whisper. She didn't flinch. She shifted sideways, pressed herself deeper behind the mast, and forced her breathing into a slow rhythm. Then, a miracle carved out of static. A short external message punched through on the handheld radio Harlow carried. "Sable, this is Dust Off. Rerouted. 2 mics out. Hold. Extraction wasn't gone. It was delayed. There was a hard clock now, 2 minutes, maybe less depending on the wind and the ridge. Captain Harlow barked orders, voice snapping like a whip. LZ side. Move. Cover fire controlled. Don't bunch. The defenders began the final movement. Wounded carried, rifles up, smoke deployed with intent. The enemy tried to reassert control, shifting fire to the LZ approach, trying to pin the withdrawal in the open. Mara found the crew-served gunner responsible, set up behind a rock with a clear lane to the route the defenders had to cross. If that gun kept firing, the runway would become a slaughter. Mara had one round left that she trusted. She steadied the rifle against the mast, ignoring the drone above, ignoring the way her cover trembled under incoming fire. She focused on the gunner's shape, the way he leaned into the weapon, the way he adjusted as if he owned the space. Crack! The gunner's body sagged. The weapon dipped, then went quiet. The lane opened. Below, Captain Harlow's team surged through, not fast, not panicked, just moving with the kind of discipline people found when they stopped trying to be brave and started trying to live. Mara stayed on the perch until the last pair crossed. Then she slid the rifle back, moved down the ladder with the same careful timing she'd used to climb up, and disappeared into the smoke. Not as a visitor, as a reason they still had a chance to leave. The helicopter's rotor wash turned the dawn into a storm. Dust spiraled. Smoke tore apart. Faces looked up from the ground with the dazed disbelief of people who had expected to die an hour ago. Mara sat strapped in along the interior, rifle case at her feet again, as if she could fold the morning back into something ordinary by closing the latches. Across from her, Daniel lay on a stretcher, bandaged and pale, eyes open. He watched her with a look that held too many emotions to name. He started, then stopped, throat working. Mara leaned closer, voice low, so only he could hear. Save your strength. Daniel's eyes flicked to the case. You never told me. Mara's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in old pain. I didn't want that life to reach you. And now it did, Daniel whispered. Mara didn't deny it. She simply touched his hand the way she had the night before, brief grounding. Captain Harlow stood near the open door, headset pressed to one ear, speaking to higher command as the helicopter lifted away from Outpost Sable. His shoulders looked heavier than they had yesterday. Back at the larger base, the debrief was clean and fluorescent and smelled like coffee that had been warmed too many times. A major listened with a face like stone while Captain Harlow explained the timeline. The sensor pole hit, the lights cut, the mortars pre-ranged, the pulsing jamming that baited transmissions. He described the way the attackers had shaped the fight, the way they'd focused their assault element, not on the barracks, but on the ops room corridor. They weren't there to wipe us out, Harlow said. Not primarily. They wanted the hardened data module, the sensor logs, our interdiction routes, informant timing, response windows, a propaganda win, and an operational jackpot. The Major's jaw tightened, and they knew where it was. Yes, sir. Harlow's eyes stayed steady. They'd been probing for weeks, testing us, mapping blind spots. Their pulse jam wasn't just interference. It was a trap. They were baiting transmissions to locate our radios and leadership. The Major exhaled slowly, then glanced at Mara. And you, he said. Not a question. A wait. Mara met his eyes without flinching. I saw what they were doing. The one thing you can't afford to lose, Captain Harlow added quietly, wasn't the radios. It was the module. She understood the target before we did. The room held a silence that wasn't comfortable. Protocol lived here. Reality had happened elsewhere. Kravitz stood in the back, unusually quiet. When Mara's gaze brushed him, he looked down as if eye contact might burn. The Major asked about the rifle, about authorization, about choices. Captain Harlow answered without hesitation. I made a call, sir. I'll own it. Mara didn't interrupt, because she knew what it meant for a commander to say that. How many invisible risks lived inside those words. Later, when the questions ended and the paperwork began, Mara found herself alone outside the building, sitting on a low concrete step with the case open in her lap. She wiped dust from the rifle with a cloth she'd carried out of habit, fingers moving in the old ritual. Not celebration. Maintenance. A way to keep her hands from shaking now that the adrenaline was gone. Footsteps approached. Captain Harlow stopped a few feet away, then sat down beside her without speaking for a moment. You saved my people, he said finally. Mara kept her eyes on the cloth. I did what I could. You did more than that, Harlow replied. You turned a massacre into a hold. Mara's throat tightened. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Harlow's voice softened. None of it is. Across the yard, Daniel was being wheeled toward the medical wing. He turned his head as he passed, eyes searching until they found Mara. Their gaze held. A mother who had come to visit. A son who had wanted to protect her. A truth neither of them could unlearn now. Mara closed the case gently, snapping the latches shut one by one. The sound was small, final. She stood and walked toward Daniel, toward the uncertain future that came after being seen. And in her chest, a quiet echo settled. Simple, heavy, unforgettable. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone ignored.